In this tutorial, I'll introduce you to using textures. I'll show you how to create them and how to apply them. Textures are what you use to add surface detail to the objects in your model. Textures can make a wall look like it's made of brick, a product appear to have a fresh coat of paint, and a package showing your client's graphics. Using a texture is faster and more efficient than using explicit geometry for surface details. Design 3D supports many different types of textures. These include solid textures that go all the way through the object, effect shaders for special case uses, such as catching shadows, volumetric textures for mist and fog type effects, and image textures that wrap pixels around the object. Image textures are the primary texture type and what we'll focus on in this tutorial. Textures are managed in the Resource palette. In the lower part of the palette, you can see the libraries of pre-made textures that come with Design 3D. You can hide and show the library section by clicking on this button. These pre-made textures are often a good way to get started. You can use them as they are or edit them to fit your needs. You can save textures from your projects for easy reuse for your own custom libraries. You can even purchase additional libraries to expand your possibilities. Let's apply some of these textures. First, we'll select the cube using the Move tool. Now we'll select a texture from the Resource palette and click on the Apply button. You can also drag and drop a texture onto the surface of an object. You'll notice there's a limit to how realistic the texture appears as I've been applying them. This is because I'm using simple hidden line OpenGL display method. If I add the Live Ray option to my modeling view, you'll see that the textures are displayed in full quality preview. Now I'll select the cone. If one or more objects are selected when you create a new texture, the texture will be automatically applied to them. We'll just create a simple texture here. You can see that the new texture was automatically applied to the selected cone. The top section of the Resource palette shows the resources you're using in your current project. In this case, you can see that the textures that we've applied now show up in the top section. You can edit a texture by selecting it in the palette, then hitting the Edit button, or you can simply double-click on the texture. Let's take a closer look at the texture dialog. The image texture dialog is set up in 3 sections. The left side are the channels that give you control over each of the elements that make up a texture. The top right is the preview of your texture. You can switch out the model used in the preview by using this menu on the top. Under the preview are quick settings and linking controls. The glossiness and transparency sliders actually adjust several of the channels at once to make it easy to get these effects. You'll notice that as I move these sliders, several of the sliders in the channels also move. That's because the changes in the quick settings interact with and change several of the other texture channel settings. The quick settings are a simple way to control a texture's appearance or to find a beginning point which you can later fine-tune. I'll reset these to 0 for now. The Photoshop linking controls let you load and link a layered Photoshop file into your channels of your texture. If you edit the Photoshop file, the texture will update automatically. Looking at the channels more closely, you can see that most of the channels have buttons that allow you to load in an image to control the values for that channel. Channels let you control how light reflects from, interacts with, transmits through, and emits from your object. To see this more clearly, we'll switch the preview model to something that provides a more sophisticated representation of how light interacts with the surfaces. Let's talk about how light interacts with the surface. These 3 top channels control light interaction. Diffuse color controls the color on the surface, and therefore the color of the light that bounces off of the surface. The color can be altered by using an image, sometimes referred to as an image map. In this case, the texture already contains a block wall image. You can also choose a color, which you can use without a map, or you can use a color to tint a map. To clarify how light interacts with the surface, we'll turn down the direct, indirect, and bump normal channels down to 0 to isolate how they work. By the way, you'll note that as I drag one of these sliders, they both move. That's because they're locked together with this control. This makes it easy to adjust controls that are closely related. The direct amount channel affects how much of the light is reflected from the surface. As you can see, as of right now the preview is black. There's no light bouncing off of the sphere at all. I'll unlock these 2 channels so I can just increase the direct amount without bringing up the indirect amount. When I add some direct amount, you can see the sphere reflects light from a light source in the upper left of the model. but there's no indirect or reflected light striking the lower part of the sphere. Now I'll zero out the direct amount and add some indirect amount. This shows us that there's a certain amount of ambient light in this model illuminating all sides of the surface, and on the lower part you can see a little bit of reflected light bouncing off the floor. Next we'll add some specular amount. You can think of specular as being a reflection of the light source. In this case we can see a little bit of a specular highlight from a single light source. The shape and size of the specular reflection is a function of the smoothness of the surface. When I decrease the smoothness, you can see the specular highlight broaden as it would on a rougher surface. You can see that in this preview model, there's not a lot to reflect beyond the checkerboard floor. The sky is black, and there is no reflective background assigned to the preview model. It's important to remember when you create a new model in Design 3D that if you choose the New Empty Model option, it will be just that, an empty model. So if you place an object in the model and give it a reflective texture, it won't seem to be reflective because there will be nothing in the model to reflect. Now let's talk about another kind of reflection. Your model can have a reflected environment that's a background that is used for any reflective textures you have in your scene, but you can also assign a reflected background to each texture using the embedded amount channel. Initially, when you move this slider, you don't see any effect in the preview. The reason is you need to assign a reflected background in the drawer. Drawers are an interface element in Design 3D that provides more options for the area you're editing, in this case, the embedded amount. Most of these channel layers have extended options in their drawers. I'll just select one of these backgrounds available from the pop-up that gives us access to the background library. Now you can see the reflected background in the sphere. Note that you don't see any reflection of the checkerboard. We currently only have embedded amount added, so there's no reflection of the scene. If I add back in some reflection, you can see the combination of the background and the scene. For the channels that allow for maps, you can use an image to control the effect. Maps are loaded and edited using the Image Map dialog. From here you can edit various parameters, load a map, or select one of the pre-made maps available from this pop-up menu. With this circle's image loaded, you can see that the background reflection only shows up where the map is white. When you're using a map to control or modulate the values for a channel, the general rule is, where it's white the value is high and where it's dark the value will be low. Next is anisotropy. You can think of anisotropy as those long stretched reflections that you see on certain fine-grained, scratched or buffed metals. When I drag the slider to the right, there's no visible effect. This is because anisotropy is dependent on specularity combined with smoothness. When I add some specular amount, you can see the specular highlight stretches across the surface as if there were some fine grain to it. If I switch back to the tile preview model, you can see the effect a bit more clearly. Notice how the surface has a kind of brushed or silk look. We can control this effect further by using an image map. To see this better, we need to make the surface less smooth. Now let's talk about transparency. Many factors come into play when trying to make an object appear to be transparent. With the opacity slider set to 0, you can see that the diffuse color is filtering the light as it comes through the object. One thing that's missing from this transparent object is refraction, or light bending as it goes through a solid object. From this slider and pop-up menu, I can adjust the index of refraction. If I select something like glass, you can see the light bend as it goes through this tile object. One thing to remember about refraction is that it does require a solid volume that is one-sided. You can find the control for making your surfaces one-sided in the Object Properties palette. We've already touched on smoothness and index of refraction, so now we'll move on to the glow channel. Glow can be used to turn an object into a light source when you render using radiosity. Let's go back to the sphere model we were using to see the effect a little better. You can see that not only is the surface bright, but it's also casting light onto the checkerboard surface. Like all of the channels we've discussed that allow for maps, you can use an image map to selectively apply glow to a surface. You can see that the glow is now only emanating from the white areas of the circles map. By the way, one thing to note when editing textures, you always have the option of clicking on the Apply button to see the effects of the texture editing as it actually looks on the object or objects you have it applied to. You just have to have the Live Ray option turned on and the object with the texture applied visible in the view. Next is the Bump Normal channel. In order to see the effects of this channel, we'll need to have at least one other channel turned up. The Bump Normal channel requires that a map be loaded in order to modulate the effect. In this case, we already have this rock face grayscale map. When we turn the bump slider back up a bit, you can see the effect. If I crank this up, the surface really gets rough. If I drop it down, you can clearly see the difference. A quick note on the difference between bump, which are grayscale, and normal maps, which use color to indicate direction. Both maps alter the normals of the surface. A surface normal can be thought of as a little arrow that points directly outward from the surface of the object. These normals can be bent using bumps and normal maps. Normal maps just do it with more precision. Bump maps use gray values to indicate where the surface should be high and low. Normal maps use color to indicate the direction the normal should point. When you use a normal map, be sure the Use Image as Normal Map checkbox is checked, and that it's unchecked when using a grayscale bump map. Next is the Shadowcast Map channel. This simply lets you alter the object's shadow using an image map. You can notice the subtle effect of this honeycomb map in the shadow. The last channel is the Mask channel. As the name implies, you can use this channel to place in a map to mask the texture's effect. The mask uses the black areas to reveal whatever is underneath the surface. If there are other textures layered under this one on your object, that texture will be revealed. In this case of our preview model, there's no other texture under this one, so we have the option of revealing to white or invisible. The slider lets you adjust the overall effect of the texture. With the pop-up set to invisible, you can see the sphere starts to disappear. If I change the pop-up back to white, you can see the effect of this texture just fades out towards the white undersurface. So that's a quick overview of how you create textures. Remember that you can always load a pre-made texture from the library. Sometimes these pre-made textures are a great starting point if you want to create your own texture. Design 3D provides a few ways to manage how a texture is applied to the surface of an object. Let's look at the Textures and Effects panel to review some of the options. First, I'll drag a second texture, this brick, onto the sphere. You can see at the top of the Textures and Effects panel, it lists the textures applied to the selected object. The options in the panel apply to the texture that's selected in this list. In this case, the brick texture. The Map pop-up menu controls how the maps of the texture get wrapped around the object. Currently, it's set to UV mapping. UV stands for the two directions of the surface if you were to think of it as being flattened out. U being the horizontal direction and V being the vertical. This pop-up menu contains the texture mapping options. At the bottom is the UV mapping style. The other options are what are known as projections. You can think of projections as if there were a projector inside the object and the pixels of the map are being projected out using one of these methods, which include planar, in this case it's a plane projecting down from the top, decal, which is similar to planar but only shows on the side it's projecting from, cubic, which projects from 6 sides, two kinds of cylindrical, and then spherical, which in the case of a sphere object is the same as the UV mapping. The next pop-up provides options for how the maps would repeat if you have the coverage set to something less than 100%. The last pop-up provides options for how to mix textures together if you have more than one stacked up on the surface. This is just a brief overview. There's much more to learn, such as using UV subsets, editing the UV layout of an object's surface, using solid textures, volumetric textures like mist, using effects, and more. As with all other subjects in the Getting Started series, You'll want to check out the user guide and also the Strata 3D University to learn more. I hope this gives you a good start to creating the surface effects you want using textures.